Okay, you all should have heard that. Today, the speaker here today is James Shore. We're really excited to have him here today. He's the author of The Art of Agile Development, which is the second edition of his book, just came out, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. He's also the co-creator of the Agile Fluency model. He's a consultant and a coach, and he's been an Agile practitioner and leading teams in practicing Agile since about 1999. And specifically, he's had a big impact on our area and really the creation of PhillyXP. So I know, speaking for myself and Anthony and probably Nick as well, we're really excited to have him here today because he did do his immersive coaching in the Philadelphia area and really planted the seeds for an XP community in this area. So it's really exciting to have him here today. So I think before you get started, Jim, should we just do a little kind of description of how the talk's going to go today, and you can fill in if I've missed anything.
Sounds great. Yeah.
So the idea is Jim's going to read a section from his book, and the idea is to after that to have a conversation about some of that material. So as he's reading, if you think of questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll try to curate those as we go. And then when we get to a point to have a discussion, I can bring up those questions, or if you think of questions there, you can bring up questions there kind of in real time as we have a discussion. And then about kind of around the halfway point, we'll switch to another section in Jim's book and kind of do a similar process there. He'll read another section of the book and we'll have a discussion about that. Does that pretty much cover it?
Sounds good to me.
Excellent. All right. So I'll turn it over to you, Jim.
All right. Thanks very much. Happy to be back, virtually back anyway. So thanks so much for having me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read let me share my screen. I'm going to read an excerpt from the book, which is available in both ebooks, and I don't know if I'm still visible, but there's a print version as well, which O'Reilly was the publisher. They did a beautiful job with it. I particularly love the cover, which is very similar to the first edition cover, except they added a goldfish. And if you ever want to know why there's a goldfish on the cover, get me for beers. The book is organized around 3 fluency zones, which comes from the Agile Fluency model I created with Diana Larson. The first zone of fluency is the focusing zone. The second one is the delivering zone. And the third is the optimizing zone. And this roughly corresponds to the 3 major styles of Agile development that Diana and I see in the world. It's not a maturity model. People don't go from one to the other. Instead, different zones are used by different teams and organizations. Oftentimes multiple zones together, but it's very much a pick and choose which ones are appropriate for your situation. Focusing zone fluency means really understanding how to focus on the business results that your organization is looking for, how to work well as a team, how to understand what stakeholders want from you, and so forth. Corresponds more or less to what you see from teams that really focus on Scrum. Delivering zone is about being able to deliver reliably. It's about having high quality software that you can ship to production whenever your stakeholder, customer, on-site customer wants. And it has a lot of material related to the XP practices in it. Really, that's what you see is XP teams tend to be in this delivering zone, at least fluent XP teams do. And they also tend to be fluent in the focusing zone as well. And then the optimizing zone is teams who have the ability to really understand their market well and to optimize their work to achieve the best market outcome for their organization. It's characterized by ideas like lean startup. You can pursue any or all of these zones that you want together or separately. What we tend to see is that teams learn and grow over time, starting with the focusing zone, then moving into the delivering zone, and then rarely the optimizing zone. But again, it can happen in any order. Anyway, the book is organized in 4 parts, 3 of which are about these 3 zones. And I'm going to read to you the introduction to part 3, which is the delivering zone. A lot of XP stuff in here. I'm an old XPer. I love XP. And I thought it would be of most interest to this group. Am I coming through okay, Anthony? I can't see anybody's faces anymore.
You sound good.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and get started. Part 3, delivering reliably. It's October again. Over the past year, see Part 2, your team has been working hard at developing its delivering fluency, and now you're a well-oiled machine. You've never enjoyed your work more. The little annoyances and friction you associate with professional software development, broken builds, frustrating bug hunts, painstaking change analysis, have all melted away. Now you can start a task and have it in production a few hours later. Your only regret is that your team didn't pursue delivering fluency from the beginning. In retrospect, it would have been faster and easier, but people wanted to take it slow. Oh well, now you know. As you enter the team room, you see Valerie and Bo working together at a pairing station. They both like to come in early to beat rush hour traffic. Valerie sees you putting away your backpack and catches your attention. Are you available to pair this morning? She asks. She's never been one for chit-chat. Bo and I have been working on the real-time updates, and he said you might have some ideas about how to test the networking code. You nod. Duncan and I spiked it yesterday and came up with something promising. Do you want to pair, or should the three of us mini-mob? You can pair with Valerie, Bo calls over, getting up and stretching. I need a break from networking code. He mocks shudders. Even CSS is better than this. Valerie rolls her eyes and shakes her head. I'll let you get settled in, she says to you. I need more coffee. Half an hour later, you and Valerie are making good progress on the networking code. A steady series of soft chimes comes from the workstation. Every time you save your changes, a watch script runs your tests and then chimes a second later to indicate if the test passed or failed. You've gotten into a steady rhythm. At the moment, you're driving and Valerie is navigating. Okay, now let's make sure it throws an error when the message is empty, she says. You add a test. Dong. The test fails. Without a pause, you switch to the production code, add an if statement, and say, ding, the test passes. Now when the message is corrupted, Valerie says, you add a line to the test. Dong. Another if statement. Ding. Okay, I've got some notes about more edge cases, Valerie says, but I think we need to clean up these if statements first. If you factor out a validate message method, that should help. You nod, select the code, and hit the extract method keystroke. Ding, no problems. The sounds were a result of an experiment a few months ago. Despite the jokes about Pavlov's programmers, they were a hit. Your team works in such small steps that most of the time, the code does exactly what you expect it to. Your incremental test runs take less than a second, so the sounds act as instant feedback. You only need to look at the test runner when something goes wrong. The rest of the time, you stay in the zone, switching back and forth between tests, code, and refactoring, with the steady chimes assuring you that you're on track and in control. Another half hour later, the networking changes are done. You stretch as Valerie pulls the latest code from the integration branch and runs the full test suite. A minute later, it's passed, and she runs the deployment script. Done, she says. Time for more coffee. Keep an eye on the deploy for me. You settle back in your chair and watch the deployment script run through its paces. It tests your code on a separate machine, then merges it into the shared integration branch. Everybody on the team merges their code from and to this branch every few hours. It keeps the team in sync and ensures merge conflicts are resolved early before they become a problem. Then the script deploys the code to a Canary production server. A few minutes later, the deploy is confirmed and the script tags your repository with the success. You saunter back to the task board and mark the networking task green. All done, Bo, you call. Ready for some CSS? Welcome to the delivering zone. The delivering fluency zone is for teams who want to deliver software reliably. Team members develop their technical skills so that their software is low maintenance, easy to improve and deploy, and has very few bugs. Specifically, teams that are fluent at delivering release their latest work at minimal risk and cost whenever their business stakeholders desire, discover and fix flaws in the production lifecycle early before they can do damage, are able to provide useful forecasts, have low defect rates so they spend less time fixing bugs and more time building features, create software with good internal quality, which makes changes cheaper and faster, have high job satisfaction and morale, which improves retention and performance. To achieve these benefits, teams need to develop the following skills. Doing so requires the investments described in Chapter 4. The team responds to business needs. The team's code is production grade and the latest work is deployed to a production equivalent environment at least daily. The team's business representative may release the team's latest work at will. The team provides useful release forecasts to its business representative upon request. The team coordinates with its business stakeholders to develop in a way that allows its software to be maintained inexpensively and indefinitely. The team works effectively as a team. Developers consider code and similar artifacts to belong to the team, not individuals, and they share responsibility for changing and improving it. All day-to-day skills needed to design, develop, test, deploy, monitor, maintain, and so forth, the team's work are immediately accessible to the team. The team pursues technical excellence. When making changes, team members leave their software's internal quality a little better than they found it. The team actively responds to errors by improving the underlying system that made the error likely, reducing the probability of future errors. Deploying and releasing is automated and takes no more than 10 minutes of manual effort. No manual testing is required prior to deployment. Team members are aware of how their skills affect their ability to accomplish the team's goals and improve internal quality, and they proactively seek to improve those skills. Achieving delivering fluency. The practices in this part of the book will help your team achieve fluency in delivering zone skills. For the most part, they center around simultaneous phases. Most teams, even agile teams, use a phase-based approach to development. They may work in iterations, but within each iteration, they follow a phase-based approach of requirements analysis, designing, coding, testing, and deploying, as shown in parts A and B of figure 3-1. Even teams using continuous flow tend to develop each story through a series of phases using a swim lane visualization to track progress. But Agile is inherently iterative and incremental. Each story is only a day or two of work. That's not enough time for high-quality phases. In practice, design and testing get shortchanged. Code quality degrades over time, teams have trouble figuring out how to schedule necessary infrastructure and design work, and they run out of time for testing and bug fixing. To prevent these problems, extreme programming introduced techniques to allow software development to be truly incremental. Rather than working in phases, XP teams work on all aspects of development incrementally and continuously, as shown in part C of figure 3-1. Despite being created in the 1990s, XP's testing, coding, and design practices remain state-of-the-art. They yield the highest quality, most productive code I've ever seen. They've since been extended by the DevOps movement to support modern cloud-based deployment. Together with incremental planning and requirements analysis, these techniques allow teams to deliver high-quality software regularly and reliably. The practices in this part are based on extreme programming. If you apply them thoughtfully and rigorously, you'll achieve delivering fluency. They are grouped into 5 chapters. Chapter 12 describes how to build software as a team. Chapter 13 describes how to incrementally build, test, and automate. Chapter 14 describes how to incrementally design code. Chapter 15 describes how to deploy software reliably and at will. And Chapter 16 describes how to create software that does what it's supposed to. And that is the introduction to part 3 of the book, which is really all about the XP practices and the things that have been inspired by XP, such as the DevOps movement. I'm going to go ahead and share in the chat a link to the book homepage so you can see the table of contents and all of the practices that are covered in this part of the book. It's things like collective code ownership, pair programming, mob programming, continuous integration, test-driven development, evolutionary design, feature flags and continuous deployment, no bugs, incident analysis, and so forth. And with that, I will turn it over back over to Anthony.
Great, thanks, Jim. So anyone, do you have any questions for Jim based on what he just read, or any discussion topics that you want to bring up? So there's one from Alex in the chat. He says, Jim, can you expand a bit more on the overlap you are seeing with DevOps and XP?
Yeah, DevOps is one of those things that has become sort of like Agile itself. It's been corrupted and overtaken by people trying to make a quick buck, some more honestly than others. Particularly if it's a company with a cloud offering, they almost certainly have a page telling you how their cloud offering is going to let you do DevOps without any real work. Yeah, I'm in the school of thought that believes that DevOps is about developers and operations working closely together, and that this is really an expansion of some of the ideas that we originally saw with extreme programming and continuous integration. If you look back at the second edition XP book, maybe even the first edition XP book, you'll see when it talks about continuous integration, it says Continuous integration means doing it all the way to the end. So if you are shipping a CD, when you do continuous integration, burn a CD. If you are deploying to a server, when you do continuous integration, actually deploy to a server. If not a production server, then at least a staging server. So DevOps, of course, is required. If you're going to deploy to a server, and if your team's going to have responsibility for deploying a server, you need DevOps. You need people with operation skills as part of the team. And I think what we've seen with the DevOps movement is that that's been fleshed out. Like, how does that actually work? Because some of the aspects of XP in the first two XP books, XP Explained, first edition and second edition, it said do these things, but they're quite thin books. So it didn't really say how. And I think the DevOps movement was all about, does a lot to flesh that out and make that sort of real and achievable. That may have been a longer answer than you were looking for.
Excellent. Before we move on, any follow-ups, Alex?
No, Jim, that was great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I just want to say that any XP related topic is fair game for this discussion. I'm very familiar with it. That's how I got my start with Agile, and I love to talk about XP. So basically, everything related to XP is in the book, and I would be very happy to talk about any of those topics.
Excellent. All right, we have a question from Scott Wagner. He said, Jim, do you have thoughts on introducing pairing or mobbing to teams that aren't doing it currently and might be hesitant?
Yeah, that is a great question. In fact, this is such an important question that the whole first part of the book is about how do you introduce Agile to organizations, both in the forms of we've never done it before and in the much more common modern form of we have something that we use the name Agile for that's really, really terrible and nothing at all like Agile. And so there's a couple of chapters at the beginning of the book. One is called Investing in Agility and one is called Investing in Change. That's all about this sort of change management question. But to talk about pairing and mobbing specifically, first off, I think if you're introducing new ideas to a team, it's not something you can force on people. If you're doing a big change to Agile, one of the very first things to do is to talk to the team about what you want to do and whether or not they're okay with it. And typically what I'll do, now I come in as an outside coach, which gives me some leverage that people who are inside a company don't already have. One of which is that I'm here to do something specific and then I'm going to go away. So I can be more aggressive about the way I do things. But when somebody asks me to help them introduce some aspect of Agile or do an XP immersion as I love to do, the first thing I'll do is I'll talk to the team and say, this is what I'm thinking would be helpful for you. This is what we're trying to accomplish by doing this. And this is what it would look like. And I'm going to ask you to do it by the book for 3 months and then continue adapting and improving it for a total of 6 months from when we start. And at that point, we'll make a decision whether to keep or discard this new idea. And I do that because in any change, regardless of what it is, there is a certain amount of pain and anguish that comes with changing your day-to-day work habits. And you have to get through those before you can really make a rational evaluation of whether or not that thing worked. And the bigger the changes to your day-to-day work habits, the bigger that reaction tends to be. And unfortunately, going from being isolated in your cubicle or in the modern area at your desk, not having to talk to anybody, and constantly pairing or mobbing, that is a really, really big change. So I'm only going to do it if people agree to try it. And if they do agree to try it, I'm going to ask them to give it a real try and withhold judgment for a couple of months while we try it, which of course means you have to understand why you're interested in trying this and whether it's worthwhile. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do it as an experiment with somebody and just see, oh, is this going to be good for us? Let's see how it works. But especially with pairing, pairing takes a little practice to get used to. It's not something that you're necessarily going to see the full benefit from right away. So I do try to get people to give it at least a month. Now, I was pretty skeptical about mobbing when I first heard about it, because I thought, I started and I said, well, this doesn't sound any different than what I get out of doing pairing in a team room with good stakeholder involvement, with a good on-site customer. But as I investigated it more, what I realized is, well, a lot of people don't have a good team room, and they don't have a good on-site customer. And also, they found pairing really intimidating, and they didn't find mobbing intimidating in the same way. So I think mobbing is a genuine alternative to pairing. It gives you all the same benefits. It's a lot easier than pairing, and it's, for whatever reason, easier for people to adopt. And it's something you can do in small pieces. So you can say, hey, let's try mobbing on this for a couple of hours, and then go back to your regular way of working, and everything is still going to work fine. So Anthony, feel free to cut me off because I'll just keep talking and talking. But to make a long story short, how would I introduce pairing and mobbing? First, I would talk to them about it. I'd make sure I understood what we were trying to get out of it, and talk to them about whether or not they saw that as valuable. And if they did, I'd ask them their permission to give it a real try for at least a month. Although I might do small experiments up to then to just see it, but I would say, if we really want to know if this is going to work, we've got to try it for real. So Scott, did that? I need to be quiet. I need to be shorter, but did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that was great. I think, like you said, it's important to try to project the value, make sure that people are in agreement that those things are actually valuable, and then commit to an experiment of like a long enough length that you can try to see those benefits. Yeah.
And maybe it may be useful to start with mobbing, because people do find that less intimidating. I think with pairing, there's a lot of fear of imposter syndrome and being found out as not being very good at programming. Whereas the reality is, every day the computer is telling us all that we're not very good at programming.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Okay, Chris had a question. He said it's piggybacking on Scott's previous question. So what are your experiences with mob programming remotely? Are there any memorable friction points you encountered, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I have a lot more experience with pairing than mobbing. In fact, my biggest experience with mobbing, that is a team that decided they liked pairing better than mobbing. Actually, I have a weekly book club that is studying, discussing various parts of the Art of Agile Development, the book. And next Friday, the book club is at 8 a.m. Pacific time. Next Friday, the topic is pairing and mobbing, and our special guests are Woody Zuhl and Chris Luvian. I hope I got that name right. Who are, the people who sort of got mobbing going at Hunter Industries. Chris Lucian, thank you. So if you want to hear from the horse's mouth, come to that session. I'll put the link in the chat. So I've not done mobbing remotely myself. My understanding is the main point of friction is that switching drivers can be a bit of a hassle, but I would use sort of your standard, if I were to do it, which I'm sure I will at some point, I would use one of your standard pairing tools like Visual Code Live Share, Tuple. I think WebStorm or IntelliJ has a similar plugin.
Yeah, and I saw Cody also put in the chat MobSH, which is a tool I know a lot of us who are doing mob programming, remote coaching, we're using that. So that uses, you do with the handover in Git, so you don't have to worry about remotely controlling a computer and the potential latency issues that you have.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things that I recommended in the book that people check out if they were using remote mobbing. Yeah, and it basically just does the check-in to Git and a handoff so somebody else can check out. And I think what you do with that tool is you just serially share your screen. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. And the nice thing about that versus a pairing tool is it's sort of lighter weight to set up than figuring out something like Visual Code, Live Share, or Tuple or something else.
Yeah, I'd say experiment with it. There's no right tool. It's like, what does everybody use? I think there's some downsides with like Code With Me, which is JetBrains' sharing thing, but just play with them. They're all cool. Mob.sh, yeah, it's like the most lightweight.
The link to the book club I've put it in the chat. And again, that's going to be all about pairing and mobbing next week. So people, I'd love to have folks show up. It's a talk show format. So we discuss as a group the topic of the day, often with a special guest. And tomorrow is Gita Clickguard doing psychological safety, which should also be really good.
I'm not sure which chat you put that in, but I'm not seeing that. I'm wondering if you sent that by DM or something instead of the public chat.
I did. I sent it to Bill. Hi, Bill. So let me try that again.
There it is. Good. Yeah.
Yeah, and I did the same thing for the, I said earlier that I put the link to the table of contents of the book in the chat. Well, Bill got that, but the rest of you didn't. So let's try that one again too.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim.
I will be attending that meeting, that meetup. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Yeah, just going through the chat here. So it looks like Paul Moore, you had another comment too about some of the pairing tools. Some of those tools are lacking some of the refactorings. And I know I think that was my experience, I think with Code With Me also, is that the host, the person controlling the host had all the refactorings, but if you were on a remote machine, you didn't. So that's a good thing to keep in mind and why it's worthwhile to experiment with them.
Yeah, sometimes the one built into VS Code breaks when you use an add-in or something like that also.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that is the nice thing about using the mob approach. It just is easier than pairing, I think, remotely, because you can just use the mob.sh to hand off.
And then it looks like Davis Kane had another comment on that topic. As a UX designer that does mobbing sessions with senior devs and sometimes ends up driving sessions, VS Code's live share is really helpful. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so some good ideas here in the chat. I can also, I can take the links and excerpts out of the chat and publish them on the meetup page as well for everyone. So I'll take an action to do that.
A question I had, which I think just scrolled out of the chat. I think like a big strength of XP DevOps type things is that a single team is owning more things, and that we're not just a coding team, we also own UX design and so maybe product, and evaluating, did our product change actually increase click-through rates or whatever the metric is, as well as server maintenance, which I think is its biggest superpower, but also is hard because not everyone knows those, not everyone has those skills, not everyone is interested in all of those things, especially on a smaller team. So I'm wondering if you have any tips for how to do such a wide range of things.
Yeah, that is a great question. And this is actually sort of the focus of my consulting practice these days. This is something I've been sort of working on for years, is how do you deal with, well, it ties into this. Your question ties into what I'm about to say. How do you deal with modern software development, which isn't a single team? You know, XP was built really when a single team would do the work, but now modern software development involves lots of people. But we're still keeping typically small teams. You know, a non-XP team that's not, or a team that's not doing pairing will typically be 3 to 5 programmers plus maybe somebody else. I think a good XP team will be closer to 6 to 8 programmers, and hopefully with more customer representation on the team. So maybe 10 or 11 people total, but it's still pretty small. So modern software development, which requires all these things and often more people, how do you organize that? So I'm going to answer your question in 2 parts. One is, if you just don't have more people, if your team is really all there is, then then that's what your organization has chosen to do. You need all those skills, so you're going to hire for people that have the mix of skills that you need and the willingness to do it. But what I see more often today is organizations that have a lot of little tiny teams that have to work together. And what I've found works well, and actually this is newer information than is even in the book, because I've been developing this further over the last couple of months. What I found works well is something called which I call vertical scaling, which is, rather than having each team be completely isolated and need to have everything they need, you actually have teams work together to form larger groups that act as a single team. And a technique that is, I think, particularly effective for that is called FAST. It stands for Fluid Scaling Technology. You can find it at fastagile.io. And it is a way of having a large group of people self-organize into teams using open space type style techniques every couple of days, so that every team always has the right people on the team, including the right skills. And because it's self-organized, that is something that works really fluidly, hence the name, to get the right people at doing the right thing at the right time. You can also do things like internal platform as a service and a enabling team, as you'll see in this book, Team Topologies, which is really about a horizontal scaling approach. For example, you can have a UX team that provides style guides and education that teams can apply without having a lot of specific UX experience and expertise themselves. But I prefer the vertical scaling approach with FAST to that.
And does that mean that instead of having a development team and a design team and a ops team, you might have a team of 3 times as many people, and they're just like rapidly self-organizing into mini project teams?
That's right. Yeah, FAST actually, by the book, but it's agile method, or agile inspired method, so it's very, very flexible. You customize it to your own situation. But by the book, the teams form every 2 days. So using something called a FAST meeting, which takes about 20 minutes. So yeah, it's really the Ron Quartel, who created it, is also an XPer. So it's got a lot of XP inspired stuff in it. You could kind of think of the FAST meeting as a stand-up meeting that happens every 2 days. And then the individual teams that form in the way Ron did it were actually mobs, and they would work as a mob, sort of like a pair working together, and then break up and reform every 2 days. I don't know if I'm explaining it clearly. Does that make sense at all, Michael?
Yeah, it makes sense. Obviously, I'll download the guide and take a look.
It's very cool, and I have done it for real, and it works. Which when you first hear about it, forming new teams every 2 days, that sounds ridiculous. It works really well.
Yeah, it definitely sounds crazy.
That's why I like it. I got into XP because I am a sucker for trying out crazy ideas that couldn't possibly work. When I first heard about XP, I thought this is stupid and dumb and couldn't possibly work. But the people who are recommending it are people I respect, so I'm going to try it and see if it works. And hey, guess what? It did work. Same thing with FAST. I first talked to Ron years ago, and I thought to myself, this is stupid and dumb and can't possibly work, but it did. So I want to know more. And I picked his brains and interrogated him for years, and then finally had the chance to do it myself just this last October. And so now there's a company I've worked with. They have 45 people in this particular organization. Fast Scales is known to scale up to 65 people, and theoretically goes beyond that. We applied it with all 45 people, and it worked great.
And there's no permanent structures within that 45, within that group of 45?
There are people who are explicitly identified as being having a business-focused mindset, and people who have an engineering-focused mindset. And there are some structures around how do we decide what is done and who's responsible for seeing things from beginning to completion. But the teams are self-organized every couple of days.
Okay.
Was Ron involved in this at all?
No.
No, this was you. Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, I see one more question in the chat. So why don't we cover that question, and then we can move on to the next section, Jim?
Sure.
So this one's from Dan. Any tips or thoughts on how a PO/PM can maximize their contributions to a mobbing session, especially when that PO or PM doesn't have a coding background?
Yeah, this is a question about, and again, I think it would be great if you have detailed questions about mobbing to come to the book club next week to join that discussion, because I'm not a mobbing expert. I have a lot more experience with pairing. But this is sort of an open question for me with regards to mobbing as well. Reading between the lines as I've done my research into mobbing, it's sort of like what you see in a really good XP team with an in-person team room, and that the PO or PM product manager is present and they're available to answer questions. Actually, in a larger XP team, I actually prefer there to be a subject matter expert as well as a product manager, because the product manager usually is spending a lot of time talking to stakeholders and isn't always present. They're very strategic focused, whereas the subject matter expert can answer the detailed day-to-day questions about, well, we just encountered this edge case. What do you think we should do in this situation? I want there to be somebody to answer those questions in the team room all the time if we're pairing, but they're not actually talking with the rest of the team all the time. Now, in a mobbing setting, I understand that it's somewhat similar in that as the mob works, they will occasionally come up with things that require a business perspective, and it's good for the person with business experience to be there, but they're not always necessarily paying 100% attention to what's going on. Now, this is my understanding of how mobbing works. I could have it completely wrong. A lot of teams are not able to get PMs to sit with them, and when I ask about this, I don't see the level of involvement that I would like to see. So let me actually turn this around, because I know we have some people here who have done a lot more mobbing than me. How would you guys answer that?
Yeah, I guess I could start. So I've been doing it, practicing it and coaching it for, I guess, the last five years now. My experience with it is very similar to what you're saying, Jim. When you're in person, it's great because you have that product owner there and they can kind of jump in and answer questions in real time, much like you would in an XP team room. Virtually, obviously, it's a little bit harder. What I've done with the teams that I've been working virtually is that, you have either a Slack channel or you have a WebEx room that's dedicated to the mob or the ensemble, and they're all in those chats. So you can @message them and they'll join the session and be able to answer questions that way. So I found that works really well. There's been a couple times where we've actually gotten them with their hands on the keyboard, but that's more just to experience what it's like, right? Like their value is to provide their product, their product knowledge and being able to answer those types of questions. The practice that allows them to put their hands on the keyboard is the Llewellyn Falco has this concept of the strong style pairing model. So when you're doing that in mob programming, the person typing isn't actually coding. They're just taking the wisdom of the group and putting it in the computer. So you can get people who aren't developers to actually collaborate with you and even take a turn at the keyboard, and you just give them a little more, explicit instruction, right? Tell them keyboard shortcuts instead of extract a method. But really, I think the real value, while they can do that, the real value is them just being available to answer questions.
Yeah, and I'll echo, it's not just answering questions, but they start to get addicted to that feedback loop, especially if they're doing more front-end type stuff. Anthony, and what I've seen too is that it really depends on the individual, their appetite for getting on the keyboard versus not. And I just kind of let the team decide what mode they want to work in. But honestly, the product owners that can start recognizing they can get, almost tangible results while they're there, they really, flock to it.
Should I go ahead and do the next excerpt, Anthony?
I think so. Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I really want to get to this one because this is about evolutionary design, and this is my favorite topic in the whole world. So I'm going to read the introduction to this chapter. We haven't actually, the book itself is mostly a how-to book. It's got lots of practices in it, like pairing and so forth, describes how to put that practice into practice. I'm actually not reading any of those excerpts. Instead, I'm reading the introduction. So you'll have to imagine the actual how-to material. Anyway, chapter 14, design. Software typically becomes more expensive to change over time. I'm not aware of any good studies on this, but I think it's something every programmer has experienced. When starting a new code base, we're incredibly productive, but as time goes on, changes become more and more difficult. That's a problem for Agile. If change becomes more significant, well, there's a typo. If change becomes significantly more expensive over time, the agile model doesn't make sense. Hold on 1 second, I gotta write this down. More significantly more. Thanks. If change becomes significantly more expensive over time, the agile model doesn't make sense. Instead, the smart thing to do would be to make as many decisions as possible up front when they're least expensive. And in fact, that's exactly what pre-agile methods tried to do. For agile to work, the cost of change must be relatively flat or even just decreasing over time. Kent Beck discussed this in the first XP book. A flat cost of change curve is one of the premises of XP. It is the technical premise of XP. If a flattened change cost curve makes XP possible, a steep change cost curve makes XP impossible. If change is ruinously expensive, you would be crazy to charge ahead without careful forethought. But if change stays cheap, the additional value and reduced risk of early concrete feedback outweighs the cost of early change. Extreme Programming Explained, first edition. But as we've all experienced, the cost of change isn't flat. It does increase over time. Does that mean agile teams are doomed to collapse under the weight of unmaintainable code? The brilliance of XP was that it included practices to proactively reduce the cost of change. Collectively, these practices were called evolutionary design. XP remains the only mainstream agile method to include them. That's a shame because without evolutionary design, agile teams do collapse under the weight of unmaintainable code. I first heard about evolutionary design in 2000. It sounded ridiculous, but I respected the people recommending it, so I tried an experiment. My team was just about to start a new project. We started with traditional upfront design, then applied evolutionary design from that point forward. It worked. It worked incredibly well. Evolutionary design resulted in steady improvement, giving us a design that was cleaner, clearer, and easier to change than the upfront design we started with. I've been pushing the boundaries of evolutionary design ever since. My experience is that evolutionary design does decrease the cost of change over time. I've seen it over and over again. As with traditional design, I'm not aware of any good studies on this, but I do have some empirical data to share. From 2012 to 2018, I produced a live coding screencast about evolutionary design and other XP practices. I produced over 600 episodes, resulting in 150 hours of meticulously documented evolutionary design. The phenomenon I'm talking about, steadily reducing cost of change, happens many times throughout the screencast. One example occurs in the screencast implementation of live networking, shown in figure 14-1. I broke the networking feature up into 5 stories. First, I networked the user's mouse pointer, which took 12 hours, then line drawing, 6.5 hours, clearing the screen, 2 3/4 hours, and 2 tricky polished stories, 3/4 hour and 1/2 hour. Although the final 2 polished stories were much more complicated than the initial networking stories, they were also much faster because they could rely on a clean underlying design. This matches my real-world experience. In the real world, each new design challenge goes through the curve shown in the figure, leading to a kind of sawtooth appearance to the cost of change. The overall trend, though, is downhill. With evolutionary design, your design gets steadily better over time, making your software easier and easier to change. The improvements mesh together too. For example, the final networking changes also benefited from previous design improvements I had made to front-end event handling code. Traditional design starts out fast when everything's a clean slate. Evolutionary design is the opposite. In the beginning, you're still feeling your way around, evolving the design as your team has new ideas. But then traditional design slows down and evolutionary design speeds up. After about 4 to 6 weeks, in my experience, the curves have crossed. Code built with evolutionary design is faster and easier to work with than traditional code of the same age, and it keeps getting better. Evolutionary design is essential to long-term success with Agile. It's revolutionary, and barely anyone knows about it. This chapter has 3 practices for evolutionary design. Incremental design allows team members to design while they deliver. Simple design creates designs that are easy to modify and maintain. Reflective design continuously improves existing design. And that is my introduction to evolutionary design.
Any questions for for Jim on evolutionary design?
Or
Hey,
I'm happy
Jim,
to just have a conversation about it.
it's Anthony. Jim, I did have a question because uh, by no means am I an expert in thinking about, systems and in an iterative or, an evolutionary way. But I do feel that it is a skill that needs to be kind of like learned and experienced, as a group and as an individual. And I think I struggle sometimes with making assumptions that people are ready to think that way, as a manager of teams and stuff like that. So, like, I know that a lot of your work has like maturity models and that kind of stuff. But is there like a signal in your mind that like a team's ready to, proceed with evolutionary design versus needing to do a little bit more due diligence up front?
That is a great question. And one of the things that I hear people say is that evolutionary design is really only appropriate for teams with a lot of development experience, because it depends on their, having great design skill. That's not my experience. I think the secret to high quality software is good internal quality, which means good design. And so I think design skills are absolutely essential for successful long-term sustainable software development. And evolutionary design is easier than upfront design, not harder, because upfront design requires that you have the experience seeing things fail so that you know what pitfalls to avoid. Whereas evolutionary design takes advantage of the same sort of design skills that upfront or predictive design does, but doesn't require the same level of deep experience knowing what's going to go wrong. Because of course, if you do a predictive design, if you make a prediction about what the design should be and you get it wrong, it can be really painful to undo that, because it's harder to delete code that was wrong than to add code that was never there in the first place. Because code that's already there has its tendrils sort of sucked in throughout the entire system. So given the choice, I would choose a team that had at least one experienced designer on it in all cases. But if I didn't have that option, I would teach the team how to reflect on their design. That's the reflective part, how to evaluate the existing design, see the flaws and refactor to improve it, before I would try to teach them how to do the predictive design, because predictive design requires more advanced knowledge and experience than evolutionary design does. What do you think of that, Anthony?
Sorry, I was struggling to come off of mute there. Yeah, no, I think that does make sense. I think the thing that maybe can get in the way there is that not all teams have that designer skill, right, available to them. So, I guess in that way, it's probably good to know, or to be able to assess a team's kind of like sense of that by maybe just trying or experimenting on smaller things and, getting a sense of where they go from it. But otherwise, I think I agree with what you said and the approach.
Yeah, I know there's other questions out there, so I won't belabor the point. But one thing I see in the modern age, where we've got so many people coming into software development who are brand new, is that design skills in general are really, really hard to find. And it's not taught in schools. It's really not taught anywhere. It's something you only get, I think, through experience. So I guess what I would say for somebody like you who's a manager is invest as much as you can in helping people develop their design skills.
Great. All right, there's a couple hands raised and then a couple questions in chat. So let's hit the chat questions and we'll make sure we get everyone with their hands raised as well. So Eric, I saw you put a question in the chat. I don't want to mess it up. Do you just want to ask it?
Sure. Is evolutionary design more appropriate in product versus IT groups, especially like data integration, where you have a tremendous number of parallel tasks that touch everybody?
Yeah. So the book here is really oriented at the individual team level. It doesn't talk about, it has a chapter on scaling agility and the horizontal versus vertical scaling, but it doesn't really look at the question of how do you organize design across multiple teams, which is a big, complicated question. So within a single team, I don't think there is a substantial difference in design work between product and IT groups. The major difference is that IT may have a lot more data integration involved, and it is harder to do evolutionary design on database schema when you have a lot of data migrations. So it's something I would be cautious about, and I am going to put more effort into trying to understand the design of my database and getting it right, or putting in an approach that allows me to evolve easily. I recently saw a tool that used views to allow very easy refactoring of databases, which I thought was clever.
Okay, so let's get there two more in chat, and then we'll go to the raised hands. So Tristan had, hi Jim, how do you see the impact of evolutionary design on the architect's role?
That is a hard one to answer because everybody has a different definition of architect. So Tristan, what do you mean by architect?
Hey Jim, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Cool. So thank you for asking that. I've seen the same problem where sometimes architect is the more senior developer on the team, and sometimes like the big enterprise architect that defines the diagrams for all the systems in a specific business unit, for example. I'm asking the question mostly, it could apply to any architect, but what I've seen a lot in architects is they are encouraged to think upfront so that the team does not have to face design challenges. Yeah. And I was curious to hear if that's your experience as well, and how do you get architects to adapt their approach to allow the team to let the design emerge?
Yeah, I think there's really two questions there. One is, how does an architect work in an evolutionary design environment? And the second is, how do you convince the architect to do that? And I'm going to ignore the second question because that's really about change management. We've already sort of touched on that. But in a perfect world where your architects are excited and interested in making evolutionary design work, what is their role? There is a real lack of design skills on teams. And what I like to see from architects is more of a hands-on coaching role. In some organizations, you see the ivory tower architect who sort of sits back and declares, this is the design that everybody is going to use. And the problem is that it's very common for that ivory tower architecture to not work in practice. And then you have people with junior design skills adapting the non-working design they've been handed to deal with the actual constraints of the system that they're working in and creating a mess as a result. So what I would prefer is that the architects are getting in there and getting their hands dirty and coaching teams. And I see the job of anybody with a senior title as raising the capabilities of the people around them. So I want to see those architects raising the design skills of their teams. I have a phrase, which is, I want to see roving bands of feral architects. So that is architects who move from team to team, use the experience of working with lots of teams to understand the issues in the organization, work together to share that understanding. But they're feral architects. They actually are in the wild, tooth and claw, working in the code and understanding the design for real.
Thank you.
That was well said.
The next question is from Ron. So Ron, I think quoted what you said, invest in helping your people develop their design skills. So any recommendations?
The best book I'm aware of for design, the one that taught me the most, is Martin Fowler's Refactoring book. It is now in a second edition. I learned more about good design from that book than any other. Eric Evans' Domain-Driven Design is also excellent. And if I may humbly suggest that people check out one of my screencast series, which is called, well, I've got several, but the one I'm thinking of is Test-Driven Development, Lunch and Learn. It's a free series. It's on my website, jamesshore.com. And it doesn't get into a lot of evolutionary design work, but it does have enough sort of fundamental design that I think it will be interesting and useful for folks. And there's also, well, quite a bit about design in my Art of Agile Development book, at least as a good starting point.
Well, thank you.
Sweet. I think I'm next. I think you're muted, Anthony.
Yes, I was muted. Go for it, Cody.
Sweet. So my question is always the fun question. So you said in the beginning, evolutionary design was this crazy idea and you weren't sure about it, but you heard from people that you trusted that it works. So you gave it a shot. I'm curious, what are some ways you've kind of influenced places to try evolutionary design? So I want to tell a little story quick of one of the previous companies I used to work at. I was on an XP team. We were kind of sheltered by leadership, had this little bubble inside of this agile corporation. It was amazing. Leadership changed. And we had some product owners come in and they were like, oh, hey, we want to design for this new feature, a big doc. We're like, well, we don't really do those. You know, we work kind of incrementally. We make small things. And I had just a lot of conversations and arguments about not having to write the doc. So I'm curious, what are some things that you've done in those situations?
Yeah. So the story you're telling is unfortunately, I think the classic death knell of XP. A team that's working amazingly, leadership changes, and there's no buy-in, and then it collapses, which is always sad. This really is, again, a change management question, and it's I am fortunate in that people bring me in when they have either opportunities they want to pursue or problems they want to solve, more often the latter, because that's just human nature. And I come in from a position of, kind of, I'm already known, I've got a book. So when people hire me, there's a certain amount of gravitas I just bring with me. So I can just say, hey, you're having this problem and evolutionary design would fix it. And there is a certain amount of talking to people and convincing. And the way I do that is mostly by putting myself in their shoes and understanding the pain they're feeling and understanding legitimately how the things I'm suggesting will fix those pains. So I don't come with preconceptions of, oh, we're going to need evolutionary design in every case. But I often find that, for example, if they're having a lot of defects due to design quality issues, that evolutionary design and refactoring is probably one of the things they're missing. So at that point, I say, well, I'm seeing this problem. It's causing you personally this pain. Some people are more on board than others, right? So when I'm talking to somebody who's really not on board, I want to connect what they personally care about with the problems that are causing that pain with the solution that I'm suggesting. And so I'll say, you are unhappy because you are on call every night, or somebody on your team is on call every night, and you would like to be able to leave the pager at home, metaphorically speaking, and go to see a movie without worrying about it. Well, one of the things that's happening here is that you've got a lot of repeated design because this code base is many years old and people are cutting and pasting code rather than refactoring. And the only way to fix that is through incrementally evolving the code to be better. And I have those sorts of conversations. With stakeholders, typically, those might, or people who are more in a leadership role, I think in that situation, you might need to follow Martin Fowler's advice, which is change your organization or change your organization. If the leadership is not bought in and you don't have the level of respect in the organization to convince them or necessarily even talk to them, and you don't know anybody else who does that can do that on your behalf, then you might be better off finding another organization that works the way you want to.
That's exactly what I did.
Yeah.
I love that quote, by the way.
Yeah. It's one of my favorites. There is a book called More Fearless Change by Mary Lynn Manns and Linda Rising, which is full of great advice for how do you change an organization from within. But having done it myself, it's way easier to go find the organization that already works the way you want to.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great. All right. Michael, you have your hand up. You've been waiting patiently. Do you have another question for Jim?
Yeah. This kind of actually ties in well with what Cody was asking. Where my team is at, we're like about to switch to like a shape up type thing where we or have a bit, we have like less requirements, less like, instead of saying we have to have a clear ticket with acceptance criteria written and groomed before we start, we're going to start with more unknowns. And that means kind of like shifting a bit towards the sort of like, well, design of evolutionary design, and letting go of the like, so far like we've had some sort of like design docs or acceptance criteria as the safeguards to make sure that we're not messing stuff up, that we're not going the wrong direction. And I'm wondering how we can like make sure that we're doing it right, and also reassure people who need to give up the tools that tell them that we're doing it right. And like, how do I say, hey, it's okay. It's okay to start without getting team buy-in. And you don't actually need the tool you've been using to get team buy-in.
I missed some of that. So you don't need the tool you're using in terms of like a story management tool?
Yeah, so like our approach thus far has largely been, before we start work on something, we have a ticket that clearly defines, here's what's in scope, here's what's out of scope, here's what the implications of this will be. We'll have these exact 4 configuration settings that do these exact things. And I want to shift us towards like a more like, the ticket will say, we'll have configuration options to enable the different parts of the thing, and we'll figure out close to the time exactly what the flags are. That sort of thing, which I think entails some like evolutionary design type things.
It's a similar idea. It is the incremental continuous work, but I want to make a distinction between internal quality and design and external quality and design. And so evolutionary design is really about the design of the code. And where it sounds like more what you're talking about is the design of the behavior of the application. But that said, I think that what you're talking about is what I would prefer. I do find that organizations and teams spend way too much time over specifying their stories, trying to nail down everything in advance. And really, it comes down to trust, I think, trust in multiple ways. First, trust that we can work these things out, that the people who are doing the work can work them out. Trust on the parts of team members that they're not going to be punished for doing the wrong thing or for not knowing the right answer. And one of the things that makes this work is what I see a lot of people missing. And it relates to what we talked about before, which is there are a lot of so-called agile teams that are not whole teams, that are incomplete. They only have programmers and they don't have any business expertise on the team. If you don't have the business expertise on the team, then you have to specify everything in advance, and that becomes very tedious and painful, slows everything down. But if you have business expertise on the team, then you can wait and say, when you get to that point, hey, can you help me understand the detail situation of what we need to do here, or can we work together to figure it out? Does that sort of address what you were getting at?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody recently, they talked about the predictive, adaptive predictive slide, which is that in Agile, we want to be adaptive and we want to learn as we go and figure things out. But organizations have this tendency to slide downhill to the other end of the spectrum, which is predicting and specifying everything in advance. And that's just because even though it's a less effective way to work in many cases, it is an easier thing to understand and it feels safer, even though it's more risky. So people tend to have this slide towards predictiveness unless you're constantly fighting back against it. It was actually Douglas Squirrel who told me that, who is co-author of Agile Conversations, which is an excellent book.
Yeah, yep, it's a good recommendation. All right, Davis, you have a hand up. Do you want to ask your question?
I think you might be muted, Davis.
Yeah.
How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I've been having some sound issues. My question is, when you have a business expertise on your team, like you were talking about, and that's like a complete, that's your vision of a complete team. When you're kind of stuck in the middle of having, like you have your subject matter experts that are available, but not available in the way that, they are, and it's they're not the active part of the team. They are you're checking in with them maybe once a week, once every, because they are doing what they're doing. It's tough to get them the time to get somebody to sit down and go over the technology side when they've got other things they have to do. In that situation, how can you like maximize your benefit from spending time with those SMEs and making sure that you're getting what you can out of each meeting? That makes sense.
That's a great question. Unfortunately, it's the sad reality. I do think having a whole team is one of the prerequisites for success with Agile. And in the book, when I talk about investing in Agile, I say the reason we do this is because it changes our constraints. Agile works not because it's some magical idea, but because fundamentally we change our constraints to make a better way of working possible. And one of those constraints is if we don't have access to the people who know what to do, we have to specify everything up front, and then we misinterpret, and there's this long lead time, and then by the time we do it, it's wrong. Like that is a constraint that leads to all the problems that Agile is meant to solve. You can't fix that by calling what you're doing Agile and continuing to work in the same way.
Right.
So if you want the benefits of Agile, you have to change the constraints. And one of those constraints is a lack of people with business expertise allowing us to make decisions as we go. However, we live in the real world. So let me answer the question you actually asked. If you have limited access to domain experts, then you still need people with business expertise on your team. If you won't be given that by your organization and no amount of convincing, especially when you look at modern day developer salaries and the cost of delay, if that does no good, then the answer is to develop that expertise yourself. Have people on the team work to understand that. One of the ways to do so is through domain modeling, the ideas in domain-driven design, ubiquitous language and domain modeling, and customer examples. So going to your domain experts with an understanding of the situation that you need to understand and saying, can you give me examples of these things, and getting all that written up and then using as the basis of your work going forward. However, you will always find edge cases that you didn't think to ask of. And if you don't have your domain experts on the team, you will guess or you will be delayed either. And both of those options are expensive. So it's better to have the experts on the team.
That's a great answer. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. Looks like Alex, you have your hand up. And this, I think, given time, maybe this will be the last question. And then, Jim, if you have any final thoughts or anything, you can feel free to share them.
All right, no pressure. Jim, just hoping for your thoughts on how your perspective of evolutionary design has kind of transformed over the years as big technology paradigms have changed. One that comes to mind is kind of the advent of cloud native infrastructure and application development, right? So just how has your perspective of evolutionary design changed with things like that?
Yeah. So like I said in the book, I first heard about evolutionary design in 1999. I was a big proponent of upfront design up to that point. I had read and followed Martin Fowler's analysis patterns book like a Bible, and read design patterns and really believed in this stuff. And in 1998, I had just exited a company that had imploded due to doing waterfall harder and more waterfall-y than it had ever been done before. They had done it more by the book than anybody I'd worked with, and they had failed worse than anybody I had seen. They spent months and months building this complicated distributed architecture, got to the point where they finally integrated and it didn't work because the fundamental architecture was wrong. And they didn't realize this until it was too late. So I was primed to be willing to accept and experiment with the ideas of evolutionary design. Didn't totally believe in them at first. And like I said, it worked. And so ever since then, I've been pushing. And what I've found is that if you are in an environment where refactoring is possible, then there is nothing that you cannot use evolutionary design with. I've pushed this over and over again. If you can test and you can refactor, you can do evolutionary design. So I've figured out how to do test-driven CSS. I have an open source project, which is sadly poorly, is not really getting a lot of love for me, called Quixote, which is a unit testing tool for CSS. I had one of the earliest HTML testing tools, and I've done evolutionary design with all of these things, with HTML, with CSS. The main thing that's going to stop you doing evolutionary design in the modern era is low code and zero code, low code and no code, which not always, but is often has poor support for version control, testing, source code, the kinds of stuff you need in order to evolve your designs, and anything that's really expensive to refactor, which can include databases. And also, if you have a published interface, which can be a problem in a microservice heavy environment where they consider every single thing to be a published interface. And by published, I mean third parties that you do not control depend on the interface you've created. Those aren't really amenable to evolution because it's so expensive to make changes. So because I see so much value in evolutionary design, what I do is I look for opportunities to reduce the cost of change to make evolutionary design possible. So I try to avoid publishing interfaces. I try to think about my data in a way that makes it easier to change, and so forth. That answer your question, Alex?
It definitely did. I wish we had another hour to talk through that, but no, definitely.
I could. Too bad I'm not there in person. We go out for a beer or two or three, and I'd be happy to talk about this all night.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, I think that's all the questions. Any last thoughts or anything that you wanted to mention, Jim, before we close?
XP is awesome. Thank you for being one of the remaining XP groups in the US, maybe in the world. Can continue spreading the love and sharing the love. I have had more success using XP and XP inspired ideas than any other software development approach. And I think that this book does a really good job of teaching people how it works. So if you want other people to understand it, maybe suggest having them take a look at the book.
You know, that's in keeping with tradition. Philadelphia was one of the last markets for 8-track tapes, I understand too. So
I'm not sure if I appreciate the analogy, but thank you.
Now XP's vinyl, it's made its comeback with DevOps.
No, it was a great talk. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. This is great.
Yep.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been loving the book so far.
Glad to hear
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim.
I'm looking forward to reading it. Thank you.
Just
Thanks so
bought
much.
one. Ching. Bye.
Nice.
Jim, have you written up any notes on your use of Fast Agile?
I'm going to.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that as well.
Yeah. I've had enough experience now with it that I can unequivocally recommend it. Although I'd still recommend it to people who know what they're doing. I don't think there's enough information out there for people who are less experienced with Agile.
Ron's Agile Alliance, I think, paper is the most useful thing currently.
I don't think I've seen that. The Fast, most of what I know about Fast is coming from direct conversations with Ron, and but I do find the Fast guide to be very readable. It's a little bit assumes have a certain level of knowledge and experience.
For what it's worth, I can recommend you for a consulting role in a $15 billion company I work for. So
excellent. Well, I'd love for you to do that.
Maybe a little bit bigger, Ching.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much for your time. Appreciate
you.
it. Thanks, Jim.